But then what matters is also the composition of our cities, which determines its vulnerability, how much of the population is poor. New York has its own share of poor, but then Lagos has 70% of the population that is poor. Both are on the coast. So if the same hazards were to face New York or Lagos, the outcomes may be very different. However, New York has a lot of infrastructure, but it's aging. So that again shapes the vulnerability of the geography. So it's climate hazards, but it's also the internal compositions of the city. And then there is a third component, which is agency, the adaptive capacity. Whether you have a mayor like Bloomberg or a mayor like Abrad, which is willing to respond to these issues, or you have a passive mayor who says, well, you know, my election cycle is 3 years, you know, there are 2 years left in my term, and that maybe this is a longer term issue and I do nothing. That shapes risk, whether you have a responsive mayor or an unresponsive mayor, not just a mayor, but various institutions, civil society, organs of the government, combination of that actually crafts risks. So think of natural scientists here, social scientists here, maybe public administration here, but together they're, you know, shapes what is the intensity of risk. And that is very important to understand in a developing country context, because a very large proportion of the population is very poor, and much of it lacks infrastructure. Two fundamentals that we think greatly shape the vulnerability of the population. Not to mention that all these settlements are on the coast or in river deltas, and that puts additional pressure to flooding. But climate is like the last nail in the coffin, because these geographies already are under extreme stress. So if you add to the stress of these poor people, then it's really catastrophe for them. They also have lesser ability to move, migrate, and therefore are at much greater risk. What is surprising is that while we don't know the population of certain cities or how it is evolving, because this relies on national censuses and that data varies, we definitely have climate data, long-term climate data for almost every city that you all can name in the room, and a few more. And this data is out there and is not always making it to the policymakers. So our effort is to actually get some of this to the people who are making choices for the long-term future of their cities as we talk here now and wait for Cancun. The book is organized by these sectors, and each of them goes through the risk, the adaptation, the mitigation, the policy options. We hope that you'll have a class on this someday, and maybe this is a textbook, so I'll skip all that. And I'll skip the takeaways because they were meant for policymakers, but there are solutions that other cities have experimented with or scholars have articulated that are readily available for policymakers to utilize. So each of the sectors, think of energy. The choice is not as simple as let's drop coal in favor of renewables. While we do want to do that, and power plants that are using coal produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions which are undesirable, but there's a whole lot of rural China that uses coal for cooking. So you take that coal away, they don't get their meal that day. So it's a much more nuanced response that is required. There is no easy blanket solution. But graduating from carbon-intensive fuels to renewables is one possibility. We didn't switch to oil when we ran out of coal. We switched because oil became viable. We need a viable option that doesn't disrupt the economy, because that's what is going to be acceptable to both the thriving private sector that we need, especially now in this time of crisis, but also much more easier for governments to craft as a policy as we go forward. Maybe briefly, I would like to focus on this, that what is really important in the context of climate change in cities is that cities, first, that there is ample information out there for cities to respond to and incorporate climate risk into their existing plans, but also future plans. And that cities are a great places where action is occurring. As opposed to the whole national program, cities are responding. And so if we can bridge this existing knowledge with the existing motivation of cities, we would get a tremendous impact. But meanwhile, as we talk here, over the last few years, this is just a quick map of what cities are doing in terms of planning for their future. So several cities, as each year goes by, make their long-term plans. So long-term plans are back on the city administration agendas, and they're making 30, 40, 50-year plans on where their city ought to be, how will they rejuvenate their cities, take it forward. And many of these are yet to integrate climate science. So our effort is really in bringing the climate science as we prepare to finalize this to those policymakers that are shaping the future of their cities. Any plan that is taking the next 30 years into account would need to look at climate and how much of it affects their own geographies. Our effort in the climate and cities research and policy engagement is really not to say that we just produce the state of the knowledge, but we do need that, as was pointed out earlier, as a bedrock for policymakers to shape their choices. But we also see that if countries want to do a very quick, rapid assessment of their major cities and see what is at risk, that is very readily available, that scientists in the country context, collaborating with their international colleagues, can very quickly, in cost-effective ways, come up with articulating the risk for their, for their urban areas within a country. But if you want to really respond to climate change in the major cities of the world, New York spends $45 billion a year in its operating budget. This is after the financial crisis and reduction in tax revenues because lots of property values have changed and tax revenues from other sources have gone down. But to inform a $45 billion budget, it cannot rely on quick studies. You need intense research of the kind that was presented earlier. That's true for Mexico City, that's true for Johannesburg, that's true for Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo today is spending in preparation for the Olympics. These investments, like in the case of Mexico City, will remain for the next 80 years, at least. And if that takes into account climate projections, expected changes, you can greatly reduce the risk to the city because it's mainstreamed into ongoing planned investments. This is not just true for a city like Sao Paulo. The Beijing Olympics spent similar amounts of money. The launch of Shanghai and the World Expo spent that kind of money. And this happens fairly quickly. The cities don't wait to invest. They are acting because the infrastructure deficits are large. We anticipate about $40 trillion to be spent in the next 2 decades as almost 3 billion people move into cities, additional. Many of these people will move in developing country cities, almost all of it in Africa and Asia, and into very poor conditions, quite like the slums of Nairobi or large slums in South Asia. And much of that, as we talk now, waits for results of the negotiations and large investment transfers, but they don't need to do that. They can simply integrate climate risk, and that's where we think that some of the greatest gains will be in mainstreaming climate risk in this $40 trillion that gets spent and shapes the lives of the 3 billion poorest people that are moving from rural areas into urban areas. Thank you. With that, we can take a few questions.